Okay, and so I am in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through probably might be able to make it down to verse 8. Hebrews chapter 2. In this section here in Hebrews chapter 2, what we have is we have the subject of drifting away. That's found right away in chapter 2, verse 1. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. For if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received just reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him, God also bearing witness both with signs and wonders, with various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his will? In other words, this is a very serious matter, all right? And so I'd like to take some time to talk about this section here. But in this case, what I'm going to need to do is I have to spend some time talking about this from the perspective that most people believe. And the reason why is because I have found in general in the past, that if I just go right to the point and say what this section means, people get quite distracted by that, because they're expecting me to tell them the usual stuff that people are usually teaching. And when I say something that is very different from what they're accustomed to, then there's the immediate confusion that erupts as a result of what it is that I say. And so I will be approaching this section first from the perspective that other people have, and then I'll just tell you what it is that I see here. All right. Now, in general, what people do is they look at this and they say, you need to be careful and you need to make sure that you do not drift away because, historically speaking, we have lots of examples of people suffering in profound ways because of their drifting away from God. And so it's really no different now than it was once before. And so you ought to pay attention to this and you ought to be concerned about this. All right, now what people will normally do is they normally put this in the category of salvation in the sense that you've got two general groups of people who will read through the scriptures and interpret these in their own way from their own biases. All right, people will look at this and they address this from the perspective of salvation in the sense that you can either lose your salvation or you cannot lose your salvation. All right, so you have to consider the two different groups of people and how they will look at this section in the scriptures and how they will interpret it. First of all, let me start with the people who believe that you can lose your salvation. All right, now if a person believes that you can lose your salvation, then they will read this from the point of view of you had better be careful and make sure that you do not drift away from the faith that you have entered into. Because if you do, then there will be eternal consequences. Eternal consequences, and that's pretty serious. And considering the examples that God could show us from the past about him being more than willing to execute proper judgment, and consider the testimony that has been presented already concerning this, you should be concerned, you should be worried, you should be very uncomfortable throughout the entire course of your life out of fear that you might drift away from the faith. All right, this is how a number of people view this. So beginning in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. All right, because if you drift away, then you might experience eternal condemnation from God. You will go to hell. That's the perspective that some people take. In verse 2, for if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, how shall we escape And that's in effect a rhetorical question to say, you won't. You're not going to escape, all right? And so don't drift away, because every transgression and disobedience received a just reward. And if you drift away through any transgression or disobedience, you will receive a just reward. Yes, you will. And so be careful. That's how people will present this. In verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at first began to be spoken of? We have the testimony, all these testimonies, more than enough evidence to show that the Lord is being very serious about this. You need to take this seriously, and if you don't, then you are going to be eternally rejected. All right? That's how this goes. Then you have the other group of people who will say that, no, it's not an eternal rejection. You're not going to lose your salvation over something like this, because we believe in eternal security. As an example, there are people who will present it in that way. And so we don't necessarily have an eternal rejection. What people will say as an alternative is that you will experience a temporary rejection. All right? And so if you have somebody who says that you can't lose your salvation, then instead the alternative is a temporary rejection because of your sin, because you drifted away from the faith in some respect. You have entered into some form of transgression or disobedience, and so you have instead of an eternal rejection, you have a temporary rejection. For those who believe in the temporary rejection from God because of your transgression, your disobedience, and that you have drifted away from God in this respect, then there needs to be a mechanism to have reconciliation with your God. If this is only temporary, it's not permanent. It's not you are going to go to hell whether you like it or not, and so you might as well just go out and live like the devil and indulge your flesh. And there are, I've encountered people who feel that way, that they were told that they have lost their salvation and that they have been eternally condemned, and they just don't know what else to do. Why bother go through all the effort of trying to be right with God when it's clear, or at least it was clear to them, that they've been permanently rejected, and so they might as well just go and enjoy the world that they have while they're alive, because that's all they've got left, because they've got nothing to look forward to than eternity in hell. Might as well try to make the most of what they have here on earth. There are people that I've met who struggle with that, and when I've tried to convince them otherwise, some of them are sincere and they're thankful that there's another perspective. They don't necessarily embrace what I'm presenting to them right away. There are others who have just been so condemned by religious people that they would just assume, just forget about it all and go ahead and live with this belief and just not worry about it anymore. But with regards to the people who believe in a temporary rejection, you have to have a way to be reconciled to God. And in order to be reconciled to God, there needs to be a sacrificial system of some kind that a person can engage in. A sacrificial system, or perhaps a sacramental system, or a ceremonial system. There needs to be something that a person does in order to get right with God. All right? And the religious institutions are often structured for this purpose, to help people deal with the temporary rejection from God due to their drifting away by their disobedience and by their transgressions. All right, now it's unusual, of course, to find someone who has a sacrificial system that requires the killing of animals, shedding of blood, that sort of thing. What we have is another sacrificial system that most people are using, and that's called a confessional system, a confessional sacrificial system. And some groups make this a big deal. They make this a very formal event such that you will even have a priest participating in various ways, or a minister participating in various ways, or some church elder of some kind. There's a formal mechanism, or there is the informal mechanism. Informal in the sense that you can just do this quietly by yourself in a closet somewhere, or just in your mind or in prayer. Nothing elaborate in terms of a ceremony or a sacramental experience. It just depends on who you talk to with regards to how they might try to approach this sacrificial model or this sacrificial system to get right with God, because you have drifted away due to your transgressions and disobedience. All right, but these people, they believe in this way that you have a temporary rejection from God, and that you haven't lost your salvation entirely, but that you ought to take this seriously, because through the examples we have in the past, he takes this seriously as well. Some people will even go so far as to suggest that if you don't take care of business properly and right away, then there may be a question as to whether you were ever saved to begin with. Some people will say things like, God just is going to have to kill you early. He's going to have to take you out of this world because you're just simply too destructive. You're interfering with his work in trying to help people way too much. And so he needs to remove you from the planet and just go ahead and bring you into heaven right away. So there are different perspectives that people have, of course. But either way, here in Hebrews chapter 2, this idea of drifting away is a big deal to people, and people hold to this. Now, in order to have it, either a permanent rejection or a temporary rejection as part of your drifting away, in order for all of this to work, in order for this belief to take effect, you have to have a definition of what it means to drift away. You have to have a definition of some kind. In order to have a definition, then you have to have a set of laws to live by, so that when you violate some of these laws, then we know that you have effectively drifted away. All right? And this becomes the definition of the relationship that a Christian will have with their God after they've been saved. This is the definition. The definition is the set of laws that the Christian will live by, and if they fail to be obedient to these laws, then they will, by definition, through their transgressions or disobedience, they will have drifted away from God. All right, now it's unusual for a person to say laws, because if we use the word law, then there's all kinds of other theological questions that will be raised. And so we can call it something else. We can call it principles for daily living, or we can call it teaching and instruction. Whatever people come up with, it will be something other than law and obey, although some people will be so bold as to just go ahead and say it that way. But the point is that you must have this definitive list of what you have violated in order to know that you have drifted away, and in order, if you believe that you can be reconciled, in order to be reconciled, in order to properly address those particular violations of the laws that you have experienced. All right, this is how these things are handled. Now, in other kinds of relationships, it can be quite similar, where you have a relationship with another person and there are expectations that they will have of you, or you will have of them, to define what it means to be in this relationship with this person. And if you drift away in some respect, then there could be permanent separation, or there could be temporary separation, permanent rejection or temporary rejection, the same kind of thing. But you'll find that in most cases, in general with relationships, we don't have a definitive list of laws that govern the relationship. In many cases, it's quite open-ended and undefined. And some people prefer it to be that way, because if it's defined, well then, what happens if you do something that somebody doesn't like, and they want that to be in the list. They want that to be a category. So never let anything be defined, because you need things to be open-ended out of convenience. If at any time this person makes you feel uncomfortable, then whatever it was that made you feel uncomfortable becomes a transgression, becomes an act of disobedience, and becomes the means by which they can reject you either temporarily or permanently as they desire. All right. And so, you see that in relationships with other people. But what I want you to understand is that there has to be a system of law of some kind for all of this to work, for this kind of understanding to be real. There has to be a definition of this. Now, there's a problem with this, of course. The problem is that when a person is given a system of law, and it doesn't matter what it is. It can be the Mosaic law, part of the Mosaic law, the law of your church, of your denomination, the law that your pastor makes up, the law that you make up. It doesn't matter what it is. But regardless of what it is, the problem is that the law will stir up transgressions and disobedience. The law will increase the disobedience and the transgressions of a person. It will increase the opportunities and the moments and the times when a person, in effect, drifts away. The law creates an increase in sin. Now, it may be hard to believe, because, people who will embrace the law often do so because they believe that this is the way they're going to avoid sin. This is the way that they're going to make sure that they never transgress and they never drift away. We've got the rules. We've got the list. And so, it's something that people embrace sincerely, but there is an effect that happens that people will generally not pay attention to or consider. All right. Now, this effect can be experienced in four fundamental ways. At least I divide it up into four different categories. Four different ways that I would say that this pursuit that people have will definitely end in failure, all right? The first way, and it really kind of depends on the personality as well, but the first way that the law, whatever it may look like, will increase sin is through the natural rebellion of humanity. People say, that sounds like a pretty good law, but don't be telling me what to do, because I'm my own person, I'm independent, I'm in control, I have power, I'm important, stuff like that. And so if you tell me that I should not do something, well, I'm going to want to do it just because you said don't do it. That's the natural rebellion of humanity. Not everybody reacts like that to all laws. Everybody's different, but this is something that you need to be aware of, that when you tell someone not to do something, then they're going to be tempted to do it. All right, a really good example is if you have a wooden fence, a wooden fence, and on one side of this fence, people will walk, travel on next to a sidewalk or something like that. And let's say that there is a hole in this fence, right? A hole in this wood fence that's solid, but then there's a hole that you could look through. And people probably wouldn't think too much about this hole through the fence unless somebody wrote a sign and put it right next to this hole, or right below it or above it or something, and the sign says, "Do not look in this hole." All right? Now, some of you would probably be able to relate to what I'm saying and understand what I mean when I say that, because if you would walk by and you saw that sign that says, "Don't look in here," you might be thinking, well, gosh, now I want to look in there. If the sign didn't say, "Don't look in here," I would never even thought about it. And so now you're telling me, don't look here, don't do that. And through my natural rebellion, well, I'm going to look through it just to show you that I can do it, and just to do so. And so through the natural rebellion, the law will stir up sin. There's another way that it stirs up sin. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 7 when he spoke about coveting, where he said, I would not have known what it was to really covet until the law said, don't covet. And through through a person's preoccupation with trying to ensure that they never violate the law of coveting, you've got to pay attention to how you interact with the world and interact with your neighbors. You have to pay attention to that and make sure that you are not experiencing any desire for something that your neighbor has or somebody else has. That you're not coveting something that's not yours, that belongs to somebody else. And what happens is that you start thinking, no, don't covet, don't covet, don't covet, don't do that. And then you start thinking, yeah, but that does seem kind of nice. And it stirs up within you every covetous desire. And it's not necessarily in the category of just simply rebelling, the natural rebellion of don't be telling me what to do. It's just a subtlety in the sense of, I suppose that that's something that I never thought about before, but now that you mention it, I guess it's interesting, and now I'm going to start having this desire in my heart instead of something that I'll actually do, such as look through the hole of the fence. But in this case, it's just a sense, it's just a feeling, it's something that's going on in my mind, and through what's happening in the core of my being, I am violating the law. I should now be rejected by God because I am drifting away. All right? And so through the sincere desire to reduce sin and to try to ensure that a person does not drift away from the faith, you then get an increase through the methodology, through what people will have to do in order to try to accomplish this. You get an increase in sin, an increase in drifting away. All right, now with the natural rebellion, it's quite obvious with the example of coveting, with the example of a person discovering more sins that they could do that they never thought about doing before. That's something that happens in a person's heart. They're drifting away inside, and they're not necessarily going to do so in a way that other people will be able to see. All right, but it's a serious matter where they're now going to feel the condemnation that they should feel in response to the law. And if there isn't a regular person around who will be available to condemn them or be aware of the struggles that they are embracing, I'm sure that there's some demons around who can condemn you a little bit over something like that. But the effect remains the same, that a person will drift away, and then they are either at risk of a temporary rejection. If a person believes that you can't lose your salvation, you then will be having to struggle with the potential temporary rejection from God. Or if you believe that you can lose your salvation, then you're going to be struggling with the issues of whether or not you're going to have a permanent rejection from God. Now, there's other ways for sin to be increased through this kind of experience. Sin can be increased by a person's religious pride. If they feel that they have found a way to be successful, if they have succeeded in their own minds in being obedient to God, they don't disobey. They are not experiencing transgressions. If they believe this, and that they are right with God because of what they have done, now they have an opportunity for religious pride. And they will fail to love their neighbors as themselves. They will fail to do this. They will fail to obey the commandment of God, love your neighbor as yourself, because they will reject and cause harm, or they will be mean to other people who are not perfect like they believe they are. All right? And this should not be all that unusual. I'll ask people sometimes, have you found that religious people can sometimes be kind of mean? And people will say, oh yeah, a religious person is in general the meanest person that I ever encounter. A religious person, because of the way that they relate to other people in terms of their own personal religious pride and their condemnation towards others. All right, a religious person generally needs to have someone else to compare themselves with, to be able to say, that person is not anywhere near as good as I am. I am good, I have achieved, I have succeeded, I've got my flesh under control, and that person does not. All right, and this shows up in all kinds of other ways. When they make comparisons, not just with other people like that, they make comparisons with other Christians, with other folks. They express disrespect, they express condemnation, they express all kinds of things by making comparisons like, your church is not as big as mine, or your pastor is not as famous as mine is, or you're not as involved in ministry as I am. Those are ways that people will relate to each other, but this is an increase of sin as expressed through religious pride and violation of the commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You would not treat yourself that way. You don't treat yourself that way. You look at yourself quite differently. All right? And that's an opportunity to understand how sin is increased through a system of law when a person believes that they have found a way to found a way to obey that law. All right? And so by default, because of the direction that they're going in terms of how they are expressing themselves and their faith, they are by default drifting further and further away from their God. But it can be a little bit more difficult for them to identify this kind of disobedience and transgressions. For others, it becomes quite obvious, but for themselves, it's very unusual for a person to admit that this is what they're really dealing with. All right, and then there's the fourth way that the law or a system of law will stir up and increase sin, and that has to do with the fact that when a person recognizes that they have failed and they embrace this belief that they have been rejected by God, then they're going to need some sin in their life in order to get a break from all the enormous religious pressure that they are now under. It's kind of the opposite of the religious pride. Now they're going to feel ashamed, and they're going to feel guilty, and they're going to feel ugly, and they're going to feel that their God does not love them or accept them, but they have a deep need inside for love and acceptance and to have some sense of peace in their being, and they're not going to get it through the Lord because that's where all the pressure is coming from. And so they have to go out into the world and find some sin in order to get a break from all that they are under from a religious point of view. And so in this way, because of the deepest needs of a person, they're not going to have those needs met by God because they cannot obtain, what it is that they need from Him. They can't get His love because they can't repent and obey adequately enough to make it work. Then by default, there's nowhere else to go but to the world and to the indulgence of the flesh in some way. And so in that way, it will also increase sin. Through more condemnation, you get more sin, not less of it. All right, you get more of it. So these are the different ways that there is an increase. And so when a person tries not to drift away from the faith, then they end up drifting away from the faith. That's what happens. Okay, the more you try, the worse it gets. Because that's not how God designed us. He did not design us to function on the basis of a system of law. He does not design us to function on the basis of the knowledge of good and evil as the means by which we would govern our lives. We were designed to be guided and led by the Spirit of God internally through an interactive relationship between He and us, such that He would meet the deepest needs of our heart and of our being, and that would alter and change the way that we interact with the world that we are a part of. Instead of interacting with the world trying to get whatever it is that we need, we now interact with the world with the abundance of what we have, such that we can give to others as they have need, with the intent of directing them to the living God himself. All right? And so this, out of great sincerity, people believe that this drifting away has to do, a great sincerity, it has to do with a warning that you had better be very careful with regard, when it comes to your faith. You'd better be very careful, because you could experience either a permanent or temporary rejection, and out of sincerity, people try, but by default, they end up increasing the problems altogether. All right, so again, in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away." That's what people are thinking. "For if the word spoken through angels," it's all very serious, and we have lots of testimony. Then in verse 5, from verse 5, it goes in to the importance of Jesus. "For he has not put the world to come of which we speak in subjection to angels, but one testified in a certain place." And he goes on and he speaks about the importance of this person, the Lord Jesus, who has been crowned. "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you take care of him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and set him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we do not yet see all things put under him, but we see Jesus." All right, that's in verse 9, we see Jesus. It's talking about the fact that this is a very serious matter. It's all or nothing. All right, so I've spent a lot of time talking about this from the perspective that other people have. Now I'm going to tell you what I think. All right, and what I think is real simple. He says in verse 1, "Therefore we must give the more earnest heed," therefore, which is a response to what he just said in chapter 1. And what he just said in chapter 1 that we should give heed to is that Jesus is greater than the angels. All right, that's what he says. Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is important. Jesus is significant. You should pay attention to him. Therefore, because he's greater than the angels, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. For if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, all right, and that's what he's doing. He's making a comparison, saying, if what was conveyed through angels was important, then what was conveyed through Jesus is also important. All right, the writer has introduced the Lord Jesus, and that he is someone who we should consider as important, and we should take him seriously. And in this introduction, don't drift away. Stay with me. That's what he's effectively saying. He's saying, stay with me. Don't drift away from where you are now being led. The writer has introduced something. Don't drift away from it. Stay with it. Stick with it all the way to a certain point, and that point is the point of salvation. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about what happens after you get saved. He's talking about the experience and the transition that a Jew will go through, the Hebrew would go through, who he is writing to struggle with these issues and hopefully, eventually, be saved. So don't drift away from this issue. Don't drift away from this topic. Jesus is greater than the angels. What happened with the angels was pretty serious, and so what has happened with Jesus is pretty serious too. Don't drift away from this. There is a salvation to go to. That's all that he's saying. All right? He's not talking about what happens after you have been saved. He's talking about this is all important stuff, because in the end, you will be saved. Now, this is an important issue because, again, the writer does speak of this, again, in chapter 3, as an example. In chapter 3, we're going to come back to this later. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 6, but Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. You'll be a member of the household of Christ if you will be saved. If you hold fast all, the hope that he's presenting, that he's addressing all the way to the end, and that end is now be saved. Again, he says this again in chapter 3, verse 14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. And he speaks about, look, today, don't be waiting on it either. All right, he says, if we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end, which is now you're confident, now you're understanding, now you're believing. Take it all the way to the end and be saved. Don't drift away from this. All right? Now, for the Hebrews, this would have been a big struggle. For the Jews, this would have been a very serious issue because for the Jew, as they would begin to embrace Jesus as the Messiah, they would be struggling with the issue of drifting away from what they knew before, what they understood before, what they were embracing before. They were embracing the Mosaic law, the temple, the sacrificial system, and the ceremonial and the sacramental system of the temple, the traditions and the culture of Judaism, and their incorporation of the laws of Moses into their lives. Their whole life, or at least a religious Jew, a non-religious Jew, or there's a scale in between with regards to how much of this would really be a part of their lives. But for a very religious Jew, for them to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and then follow through with the implications of that belief and what Jesus has effectively accomplished, they would feel as if they would be drifting away from their Judaism, from their religion of their practices and their culture and their traditions and even the people who they are associated with. All right, for the religious Jew, they would be drifting away from that in order to embrace the new covenant and the Messiah and the new life that they would now have as a result of what he has done for them. All right, and so for them, that would be the predominant thought that would be going on in their minds with regards to drifting away from anything. They would be thinking about drifting away from the old covenant, not understanding enough or not knowing enough about the new covenant and what this new life is going to be about. That would be one thing that they would certainly be struggling with and embracing. And so for the writer to say this, he's saying this in that context of do not drift away from where we are leading you to. You may be concerned about drifting away from where you are, but we are leading you somewhere else, to something else, to someone else. And in this leading, don't drift away from this because of the things that you believed previously. This is something different. There is going to be something different here. You will experience consequences related to that. So don't drift away from this. Embrace this. Follow through with this all the way to the end, because it's there that you will be saved. And then you can enter in and experience the new life according to the new covenant that has gone into effect as a result of what Jesus has done. Okay? Now, if you haven't experienced a whole lot of this, there's lots of other opportunities to drift away. Just by moving to another church, for example. If you leave one church and go to another one, sometimes people will relate to you in that way. Whereas they will relate to you as a person who has drifted away from the faith, that you might be at risk of losing your salvation because you're not going to this church anymore. You might be going to another one, and we're not so sure about that, if that's an approved church or not. People will experience this same the same dynamic. They will experience these same beliefs in other aspects of their life experience, in other aspects of their relationships with other people, and how they will relate to one another. And so, I have a question for you for your small groups that you can consider using as just a way of starting out some conversation about this particular topic. What was your experience of drifting away while a part of a church? As one question to work with. What was your experience of drifting away when you were a part of a church before, or you may be a part of one now, and you would feel perhaps that you have drifted away in some sense? How would you relate to that? How would you describe that? What are your personal experiences concerning how you will have felt that you may have violated God in some way, or violated the salvation that you have by drifting away? What is your own personal experience with regards to that? And I also have the question here: how did people relate to you when you left their church? And then through all of this, what have you learned? What have you learned, or that is either true, or what are the kinds of things that you learned that turned out not to be true? What were your experiences, and how has that had an effect on who you are now, where you are now, and how you relate to your God now? What is the effect of all of that? What are the struggles and the issues that you may be relating to? And so that's something to maybe talk about, because I know that this is a big topic and that a lot of people get to deal with this in one way or another. And so I think it's a pretty good question to go ahead and address, and perhaps talk about some of these issues, and see how some things may be dealt with or resolved, as it comes to some of the struggles that people have. Okay, and so that's how I'm going to present Hebrews chapter 2, between verses 1 and 4 mainly, and I'll continue to address some of these other things that are found in here in the next message. All right, thank you.